everyone. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about joints. Now, this is the second of a three-part video series on the musculoskeletal system. Now, when we're talking about a joint, by definition, a joint is when you have two or more bones that meet. So if we're looking at this diagram that we have right here of the skeleton, we actually have a lot of different joints that are indicated. So we have our shoulder, elbow, hip, fingers, ankle, our leg, so our foot, our knee, and our hand. Now, for your joints to form, so for our bones to meet, we actually need to have things that help connect the bones together. And there's two key important things that do this. The first are ligaments, and the second are tendons. Now, ligaments is a type of connective tissue that connects one bone to another bone. Whereas tendons, they connect bones to muscles, because remember, bones on themselves can't move. They are only materials that provide structure, shape, organ production, the production of blood cells due to bone marrow that's found within bones, but they themselves do not allow for movement. It's muscle tissue that generates the necessary force that allows for movement. So we actually have to have something that connects muscles to bones, which are your tendons. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at an example of a joint, and then we're going to go through the different types of joints. So what we actually have right here is an example of a synovial joint, and we can see that we have two bones that are put together. We have our ligament, which connects our bones to the other bones. We have our bone marrow, which is actually found inside of our long bones. And again, our bone marrow is important for the production of blood cells. And the key thing is that bone marrow is only found in long bones. So when we're talking about long bones, we're really talking about bones that form your limbs. So your humerus, your tibia, your fibula, your ulna, your radius. Now, at the epiphyseal ends of our bones, we actually have articular cartilage. So it's a very, very flexible type of material. So like your ear is mostly, your earlobe is mostly formed of cartilage, and the key thing with articular cartilage is that it reduces friction and it allows for your ease of movement between your bones. And in between our two bones, we actually have synovial fluid, which also, like the cartilage, reduces friction and absorbs shock between your two bones. Not in this picture is our tendons, which connects bones to muscles. Now, our types of joints. We have three main categories of joints. We have fixed joints, we have semi-movable joints, and then we have freely movable joints. Now, fixed joints, there is no movement in between our bones. So that means our bones are permanently fused together. So examples of fixed joints would be your skull. So your cranium is not actually one bone. It's multiple pieces of bone that when you're an infant, in between the spaces between all of your cranial plates is actually cartilage. And after birth, that cartilage is actually replaced by bone. So your cranium would be an example of fixed joints. Another example that you can have of a fixed joint would be your teeth in your mandible. You don't actually have movement of your teeth in your mandible, and that would be a fixed joint. The second type, semi-movable joint. So this is joints that have slight movement. So for example, your vertebrae. because in between each of your vertebrae you have cartilage, and that allows for slight movement in between each of the bones. That's why you can actually bend your spine. Now, the third category, and this is the category that you have lots of movement, would be freely movable joint. Now, your freely movable joints can then be subdivided into different joints, and we really, in our class, talk about 3. So the 3 that we talk about are our hinge joint, and our hinge joint allows movement on one axis. So like your knee, your phalanges, your elbow, or also your wrist, an example of a hinge joint, I'm moving on one axis. A pivot joint allows for circular movement. And a key example of our pivot joint would be at your neck. So I can turn in a circle. Your last example of a freely movable joint would be a ball and socket joint. And here we see ball and socket joints at shoulders and hips. And the key thing with a ball and socket joint is that we actually have, in a ball and socket joint, we have spherical movement. So we have movement on one axis, circular movement for our pivot joint, and spherical movement for our ball and socket joint. So now what we're going to talk about are the types of movement of our joints. Now the first type of movement is extension versus flexion. So when we're talking about extension and flexion, we're talking about the angle that is formed between our 2 bones. So the first one that we're going to talk about is extension. So if I have my stick figure, and the leg goes, so if I'm looking at the angle between, in this picture right here, between my humerus and my tibia / fibula, right in the middle, right, is my knee. So if I'm starting at a 90-degree angle, so I'm starting at a 90-degree angle, and the leg extends to a 180-degree angle, this is going to be extension. So extension, my angle increases. Now, flexion would be the opposite. So in flexion, if I'm starting at a 90-degree angle, and my leg, so my tibia and fibula, are going towards the humerus, so in like a tucked position, and then moving to a 0-degree angle, this would be decreasing the angle between the 2 bones, and this would be flexion. So flexion, my angle is getting smaller, and in extension, the angle is getting bigger. The next example is abduction and adduction. And this is really focusing the distance between the limb and the middle of the body. So if I'm looking at our 2 bonums, I can basically cut my bonums in half. So whenever the limb is moving away from the midline, this is adduction. Abduction. So I'm moving away from the midline. Adduction is when I'm moving towards the midline. So if I'm moving towards the midline, my distance decreases. So I'm adding towards my midline. If I'm moving away, I'm abducting, so I'm increasing. The third type of movement is rotation. So rotation is when my bone is moving in a circular pattern. Now, key joints that do rotation would be a pivot joint, because a pivot joint only allows rotational movement, and also a ball and socket joint, because a ball and socket joint allows spherical rotation. So that's basically our video on joints. Make sure that you watch our last video on the musculoskeletal system, which will be on muscles. Thanks for watching.